Do you sometimes wonder how you could truly have an impact when it comes to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging? How do you know you are moving in the right direction when it comes to becoming a more inclusive individual? As Diverse as Two Peas in a Pod brings topics such as ethnicity, genders, sexuality, religion on the table. We talk about research and science, but also emotions, feelings, and vulnerability. We discuss allyship, advocacy, privilege, but most importantly, we talk action. Because without action, we stay still. And when it comes to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, stillness is never the answer. Welcome to As Diverse as Two Peas in a Pod. Welcome to another episode of As Diverse as Two Peas in a Pod. Today, I am grateful to be welcoming Camilla Montoya. Camilla was born and raised in Sao Paulo, Brazil, and moved to the United States to attend college. Upon completing her degree, she taught English, French, Spanish, and Portuguese at the language school in Brazil, after which she returned to the US and started her career in higher education marketing. Following these experiences, and after having completed a master's degree in organizational leadership, she transitioned to a faculty position, teaching courses such as industrial and organizational psychology, CrossCultural Psychology, research methods, and gender studies. She currently teaches a first-year seminar at Texas A&M San Antonio. Camilla is editor and co-author for an edited volume book on the topic of leadership biases, silencing gender, age, ethnicity, and cultural biases in leadership, which the Chronicle of Higher Education highlighted under selected new books on higher education in 2019. Camilla is very dedicated to her family and is an avid traveler. She loves experiences, new cultures, and sharing those adventures with her husband and two boys. Welcome to another episode of As Diverse as Two Peas in a Pod. Today I have a wonderful guest, Camilla, with me. Welcome.
Thank you.
I'm really looking forward to recording this episode with you. Actually, I'm glad we caught up a little bit a few weeks ago, and I love your story. So I'm glad we can share that story with everyone as well and hear a little bit more about yourself.
I'm really excited. This is a great opportunity. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for being here. And in my usual habit, I'm going to start with the question to get to know you a little bit better and ask you, what's your story?
Yeah, so I was born and raised in Brazil by just Brazilian parents. A lot of people ask me, oh, were your parents American living in Brazil? No, I was Brazilian. I was born Brazilian and grew up Brazilian. My grandparents were born on my mom's side in Germany and Switzerland. On my dad's side, my ancestors come from Portugal. So big mix, like every Brazilian family. And so when I was in high school, I really wanted to come to the US and study here and go to college. And being the oldest of four girls, which by the way is a huge family in a big city. I lived in Sao Paulo. My dad was like, absolutely not. You're not leaving us. Family is a really big component of Brazilian culture. And for 3 years, I said, that's what I want to do. That's what I want to do. And he finally let me come to the United States to do a semester of English as a second language, the ESL, right? So I came and he thought, okay, she's going to go and come back in 4 months. And I applied to college while I was here and I got in, so I stayed. So I went to Brigham Young University. Had an amazing experience there. My last year, well, right before my last year of college, I met my husband. Um, and he's from Colorado, but Hispanic, which back then that didn't phase that it was anything, because it was just, the person I fell in love with. And until I handed out my wedding announcements and people would ask me, where's he from? Where's he from? I'm like, he's from Colorado, and I just kept getting the question, where's he from? So after we got married, about a year later, right after I graduated, we moved to Brazil. My husband didn't speak any Portuguese at that time, and he had applied to graduate school. And so we thought, okay, so we don't have kids. We're in a phase of our lives that we don't have any strong commitments to anything. So let's go. You can get to know my family, my culture, and learn the language. And that was like a really important thing for me, to have, the person I was going to share my life with understand who I was as far as like my whole background. So we did that. We got to Brazil and we lived there for 8 months until we came back to the US for him to go to grad school. While we were there, we got jobs teaching English. And then I got to teach some French and Spanish. And we had some American businessmen who were also in Brazil learning Portuguese. So that was a lot of fun. We went all over the city teaching executives, and it was just a great time to look back to. And then we came back to the United States. My husband started a PhD program, and after 5 years, he finished his PhD, and we had 2 little kids by then already. Then we packed up and moved to South Texas on the border with Mexico, like literally on the border. So we lived in Brownsville, Texas for 14 years. And it was great. People were great and friendly. And my kids already spoke Portuguese from birth, because that's what felt natural to me, to speak my native language to my children. But because we lived on the border, they also grew up fluent in Spanish, which was great. About 2.5 years ago, we moved from Brownsville to San Antonio, also in Texas, about 4.5 hours north. And but to this day, my kids, they're grown up now. So one is 20, the other 17, but they're still mad that we left Brownsville. And, that's what they call home, and all the good food there and all that. But yeah, so during this time, while we were in Brownsville, I worked at the university there in the marketing department for a while. Once I got my master's degree, I had the opportunity to go into teaching, which I loved. And right now, I just finished this semester teaching at a university here in San Antonio in a first year experience program. So teaching freshmen basically life skills like time management, critical thinking, all that good stuff that they can take with them throughout the rest of college and all that. So I love the whole higher education environment. A few years ago, about 4 years ago, I had a book published on all the things that I focused on in graduate school. My master's degree is in organizational leadership, and I focused all of my research and my studies in cross-cultural leadership and multicultural leadership. And so I wrote a book with other women. It's an edited volume called Silencing Gender, Age, Ethnicity, and Cultural Biases in Leadership, where we tell our stories of being Latinas in positions of leadership in the United States, and how some of that had to go against our cultural background and the demands that were placed on us culturally, and how, we had to overcome some of those hardships to do what we did best. So that's a little bit about me.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for sharing. And there's a lot to unpack, but I think the first thing that I
Yes.
need to say is, as a father of two girls, I can probably understand your dad, as a father of four girls, when he said, "No, you're not leaving," because I'm sure he was very protective of his daughters as well. And
I was 17. When I moved to a completely different country by myself. And now that my kids are, as I said, the youngest is 17, the oldest is 20. Once they were about 15, I'm like, how did my parents actually let me go? Like, I can't understand that now.
And so going back a little bit to that story of you deciding to leave and then suddenly arriving in a completely new country, with although technically it feels like it's not necessarily far, and the American culture, I think, is quite spread around the world. I'm pretty sure you have some amazing stories as well of these cultural differences that you've encountered after you arrive, especially at that age as well, where maybe you don't have as much experience as someone who is in their mid-50s and has traveled much more and so on. How was
Right.
that like?
It was hard. So I remember, and by the way, the seasons are opposite in Brazil, of course, Southern Hemisphere, right? And so the school year is also opposite. So the school year there goes from February to December. So I graduated high school in December, and that meant that I came to the US in January. So I come from like a semi-tropical climate and moved to Utah in January in the middle of winter. And I had to walk about, I don't even know these days. I don't know, maybe over a mile that I had to walk from my dorm to the building where the ESL classes were, in the snow and all that. And so I remember doing a lot of self-reflection, that I'm like, I wanted to do this. Like for 3 years, I wanted to be here, but actually being there was hard. Right. I was very happy. I was meeting new people and people from all over the world because I was in that English second language program. But at the same time, it was so hard to just be there without family, without anyone that I had, really known my whole life and grown up with and all that. And these were all people that were nice and being added to my life. But I remember I was assigned to a dorm where I shared the room with the girl from Tennessee. And at that time, I didn't know that, meant anything. I just thought, okay, I'm in the US, everyone speaks English the same. But no, every state has, very different accents. And the Tennessee accent is very strong. And there were times that she and I didn't understand each other at all. And I have to say that I started learning English when I was 5. But in Brazil, a lot of the English learning is vocabulary and grammar. And so not so much like spoken English. And so I placed at like a higher level in the ESL program, but I still couldn't like speak well or understand like fast English. But I could read and write really well. And so sometimes my roommate and I couldn't understand each other completely. And I remember one time that she was in the hall and she was going to go take a shower, and she asked me to pass her the towel, but I had no idea. I could not understand the word towel. And because I said it a different way, I said it more like it's written, and she just kept saying the towel, the towel, the towel. And then she came in the room and pointed to it. I was like, oh, that's what she was talking about the whole time. Right. And then, so some of those things, like it took me a while to realize, okay, it wasn't like 100% just me. It's that she has a very strong accent from a state that, part of the country that has a very strong, different accent. and just like little things. I thought I had winter clothes, but I had Brazilian winter clothes, right? That were not good enough for 3 feet of snow or something like that. And I remember like waiting at the bus stop, and the bus like didn't come at all. So I waited there for an hour. My feet are all soaked, and just like those little moments that I think back and I'm like, it was hard. It was hard doing it, even though it had been my dream. Um, but it took time to learn some of the other nuances, right? To pick up on like what I mentioned before, like when I met my husband and he was Hispanic, and I didn't think anything of it. Like he was just a guy, right? But it was when people started asking, like, where is he from? And his family had been in Colorado for 8, 9 generations, and they had never moved from there. And so I started telling people they've always been there before Colorado was part of the US. So the borders changed on them, and that became a bigger thing. Also, my roommates were always going on dates every weekend, Friday, Saturday. They always had dates, and I didn't get asked on a lot of dates. And so again, like in the moment, I was like, oh, I'm not like social enough or something. But looking back, I'm like, no, I was probably the weird international student, the foreign student that just, doesn't match their expectations. So I hung out a lot with Latin American students in college. The last 2 years I was there, I lived on campus in the special housing situation that Brigham Young University has called the Foreign Language Complex, where each apartment is focused on a different language. And so there were people from all over the world, either being resident facilitators or learning a new language. And so I lived in the French apartment for a summer, and then I lived in the Portuguese apartment for, I can't remember now if it was a year and a half or 2 years as a resident facilitator, because they have a native of each language living there. And with that, I met people from literally all over the world. And that's where I felt at home. Actually, it was in that multicultural environment that I felt that I belonged the most in this new country. So
you made some very interesting point actually in that story as well, about the fact that we tend to forget sometimes with these cultural differences that actually is those little daily things that sometimes unsettle us more than things maybe that we have less interaction with. But then obviously there is those subtle things as well we don't notice at first, and then as we go through those cultural differences and we unravel a little bit more how we come from a different framework than the one we're in, then these little things start to appear as well, and we have to be careful with those. So it's very interesting. But I like the end of this story about how you find your place amongst all these other people who were also from different backgrounds, but had something in common, which I guess was being in a foreign place and not at home.
Right. In fact, I think it was 1998 World Cup. Final World Cup is Brazil versus France. And a bunch of Brazilians and a bunch of French people were watching the game together in the same room, just because we're all friends. And when France won, we were all cheering, like excited and happy for France, even though like we were Brazilian, we were just played against them. So I remember those little moments that I'm like, I like it. We really belong together, just with the common background of being foreign to the culture that we were living in. So, and if the World Cup is a big deal for Brazilians. So
Yes, which and it can become a big deal for French people as well. So that
yes.
one win in 1998 was definitely a big thing for France. That's for sure.
Yes.
Especially against Brazil, because we know how skilled they
Yeah.
are. So it doesn't
Yeah.
happen very often.
So I was happy
Um,
for you. Yeah.
one thing you didn't necessarily mention too much as part of the work you've done as well, and I think I'm assuming it's coming from this background you've mentioned now, is you did quite a lot of teaching and work around cross-cultural psychology and differences, gender psychology, I believe, as well.
That's right. Yeah. So
What
psychology,
are some of the
gender. Yeah.
things that have come up for you in those experiences, teaching others as well about these?
Oh my gosh, I love, like, cross-cultural psychology is my favorite class to teach. And the students just soak it up, and they love learning about all these different backgrounds and all that from a psychological perspective. One thing that I did, which was my favorite thing, I think, in teaching, in 2018, I developed a study abroad program teaching cross-cultural psychology. It was only 2 weeks in the summer, but I took a group of students to Brazil, where we did a 2 week course. We condensed a whole semester into 2 weeks, so it was really intense. But we were in southern Brazil, in a very German and Italian part of Brazil. So even the architecture is very German. The food is either German or Italian. And it's just, it was, there were a lot of immigrants from Germany and Italy in the early 1900s who moved there and settled there. And so I took those students there. Some of them had never been on a plane before. And they were just going as regular college students, excited to leave and go to a different place and all that, thinking that, maybe initially thinking that Brazil was all like Amazon and Carnival and all that, but they get to a place of Brazil that is not really talked about, and they fell in love with it. About 10 days into being there, I could tell that they were different people already. And so I set them around. A lot of the classes were like sitting in a circle at a park or somewhere that we were visiting and discussing topics from the textbook. And I asked them if they felt that they had changed. And they said that they couldn't recognize the person they were 2 weeks before. And so that to me was just, I love changing lives for the better. And I think that exposure to different cultures is absolutely one of the biggest ways that people grow. And to this day, they're still in touch with me, and they sent me messages on social media, or they'll post like photos from, it was almost 4 years ago, they'll post photos from the study abroad and talk about how much they miss it there and how they can't wait to visit. And it was only 2 weeks, but it can change people's lives. I did a lot of experiential learning in my regular class before the study abroad, the regular in classroom setup. And I think that experiential learning, where they have to go and do things to learn about other cultures and try different flavors and speak with people who they've never interacted with before. They really loved that too. At first they were intimidated and like, oh, like, do I really have to do this? But after they did it, every semester they would come back and just like say how much they loved doing those things. So and again, it's a part of it was in South Texas on the border with Mexico. I believe that the population there is about 95% Hispanic. And so even though for the rest of the country, it might sound like that's the minority, right? But because 95% of people there are Hispanic, they're actually the majority, and they focus so much on who they are as, you know, people from the border, that bicultural, like US, Mexico culture, that a lot of times other cultures like, you know, Indian and Western European even, or African, whatever, like South American, those are not things that they consider much. It's not part of their daily lives at all. And so it was really eye-opening for them. Going back to the study abroad, I think my favorite thing that a student said, we were eating at this restaurant, Italian food, amazing food. And the student almost started crying. And she said, I wish my mom was here. And she said, and that tears me up. She said, I can send her as many pictures or videos of this as I want, but she will never know the taste and the smell of this food. You know, and that to me was like, this is what this is all about. It's experiencing things and changing because of that. So.
I'm glad you mentioned a little bit about that experiential learning, because I agree with you. I think it has such a huge impact on how people can develop and grow and change their mindset. What is some of the things you like, a concrete things that I could do, for example, if I wanted to go and discover a new culture that I know nothing about?
Well, I've traveled a lot to places that, you know, I had no idea how to behave in those places before. So what I usually do is I do a lot of research on those places first, right? Of course, I can't learn a full language in a short period of time, but I try to learn a few words, and I try to not be like, oh, I'm coming from this place, so you need to cater to me because I'm here in your country, you know, bringing money in. That's not the point, right? So I try to like be humble about the opportunity of visiting that place. So just a quick, simple thing, right? So you're probably going to laugh, you know, being French and all that. Like when I first started going to France, I mean, I took French in college, and you know, but it had been like several years, and I didn't feel like my French. It takes me a week to get into like really good French, and then it's time to leave, right? So I'll always just start with like, start saying something in French, and they know, of course, that I'm not native or something, and then they'll switch. But I think that it helps, you know, the interaction so much. Then if I just got there, I'm like, I know they speak English, so I might as well just start the conversation in English. You know, I feel like people appreciate when you try to like incorporate their language and their culture into your interactions, and then leave it up to them to switch to accommodate you. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so learning different things about the culture, about the language and all that before getting into that culture, I think are really, really important. And then, of course, there are things that you learn while you're in that place, right? So, but like learning the faux pas, or learning like even little things like, how do you tip at a restaurant in this place? You know, that it can change very much from country to country. And but just learning, you know, like in this country, it's rude if you do this or that. Just learning those things, and not thinking like, well, where I come from, it's not rude, so I don't care. You know, that's not the right attitude to have. As I think that we have to all recognize that we're being welcome to someone else's place, right? When we visit other places.
And it's very interesting you're saying this, because if I extrapolate it to even the wider of diversity and inclusion space, I think these principles are applicable in so many ways. And culture is even more visible, I think, especially when you go into that country and it's there, even though there is an element of it that is maybe not as visible. But the first thing we need to do every time we encounter someone who is different from us is learn more about them, learn more about
Right.
what they're going through. We can't expect them to be adapting to us. And I think these are very interesting points you're making that are very helpful. I think it's the base that creating that knowledge and not assuming that the other person is gonna is gonna adapt to us. I think
Right.
is a
I
very
believe
interesting
very
point.
much in putting ourselves in other people's shoes,
Mhm.
right? And so seeing the world from the other person's point of view. And I think that if more people did that, there would be so much more peace, right? And less fighting around the world. It's just like, oh, I think this and you think that. No, like, why do you think that? Where are you coming from? And so if more of those exercises happen where, maybe I have anxiety about, relating to people from a certain religious background or ethnicity or gender or whatever. It's like, okay, so let me try to see the world from their point of view. And I think we learn a lot through this type of exercise. We don't have to change our minds, right? But it helps us accept people a little bit more.
Yes, very true. There is one someone I know who used to say that when we enter a conversation, we should always enter it, especially difficult conversations or conversations where we have strong differences. We should always enter it with the mindset of the other person is at least 2% right. And I always stuck with me because I'm sure the other person is probably more than 2% right. But I think when we're going with there is a little bit of something that they must be right about, it's a very different mindset suddenly that we're entering that space in. And
Absolutely.
it changes the dynamic as well.
Right.
And
Absolutely. And
so
I can see a lot of that with also like generational culture, right?
true.
Because so you have like boomers versus Gen Z, right? And it's like Gen Z is like, oh, boomers are all wrong and blah, blah, blah. And boomers are like, Gen Zs are all wrong. But it's like, no, like boomers are right for their generation. Gen Zs are right for their generation. We're just sharing the space on Earth right now,
Yes.
right? And so I think it's an easy example because it doesn't matter like what country, what place on Earth you are, you're going to have people who are 60 plus, you're going to have people who are 25 and younger, and so those like generational fights are also problematic if we don't try to think, okay, this person is like this because this is how they grew up and this is how they were raised and this is what was happening on Earth while they were in their formative years and all of that stuff. So I think it's a universal variable, right? The generational culture. So
that's very true actually. And yeah, there is a lot of work we can do around that for sure. I wanted to ask you, I wanted to come back to one of the things you mentioned earlier, which is your book, and the people you've interviewed as part of this book. Well, first of all, I think one thing I should ask you is if you can remind us the name of your book, because I think it tells a lot in the title already.
Yeah. So it's Silencing Gender, Age, Ethnicity, and Cultural Biases in Leadership. It was written with an academic tone, but it's an easy read and it's very entertaining, captivating, I should say, not entertaining, but captivating to the reader. So it was my project. I created it. I didn't quite interview the other people, but as an edited volume, I selected the people that I thought would be great contributors. And so I worked on finding a publisher and getting a proposal submitted and all that, wrote the introduction, preface, conclusion, indexing, which I think is from the devil, but but then I went ahead and selected 7 other women who were Latinas in the United States, who were either in current or former positions of leadership. With my master's being in organizational leadership and the focus of my research and interest being in culture and all that, I thought it would be appropriate to narrow it down to Latinas. And I say Latinas because in the US, a lot of times the word Hispanic is the word that's thrown around. But to be a Hispanic, you have to have grown up speaking Spanish, right? And Brazilians don't fit into that. And so the term Latina is, the term that includes Brazilians, being that it would be South Americans, right? Yes. Background. So some of the authors are from Brownsville on the border. There's one from El Paso, 3 Brazilians, one from Ecuador who then moved to Miami. And they basically, including myself, I have a chapter in it too. We share our stories of the cultural demands that were placed on us, either by the country culture that we grew up with, right? In Brazil and all that, the strong family focus, right? And we touch on religious demands that were placed on us culturally, and just every aspect of culture, right? The culture of being women in those places and so forth. And so, and it turned out to be a beautiful piece. I'm like really proud of it. And I don't know, just I lost my thought here, but but I learned a lot from putting it together. And I learned a lot about these other women and how my story is not unique. Their stories are not unique, and how we all share this common background of having to kind of fight and swim upstream, right?
And what have you found out were some of the common struggles that you shared amongst the eight of you?
So pretty much all of us came from families where the focus was for us women to focus on either just raise a family and count that as our job. Whereas you can do both. You can have a job and a career and raise a family, especially if you have support from your spouse or other people around you. I'm not saying that we can do it all alone, right? But with support, we can absolutely do that. And that the family component was absolutely a major one. And I talk about how my mother raised four girls, and that was her dream. Like, she wanted to be a stay-at-home mom. She wanted to especially be a mother of girls. Not that you can choose, but but she was very happy when, you know, she had all girls, and she was very fulfilled by it. And I gave it a try for a little while, being a stay-at-home mom, and I resented my husband for going to work and having a job. And it just wasn't for me. And I realized that I was going to be a better mother for my children if I also had a career, that they would get a better version of me if I wasn't, you know, home all day. And so it was kind of like fighting against those cultural demands that were placed on us. One example is like that in Brazil, a lot of women volunteer outside of the home, and they spend hours and hours volunteering for different things and helping others and this and that. And that is seen as okay. But once you start getting paid for what you do, not so much. And true that things have changed, right? A little bit, and there's progress in that area. But there's a lot more work that can be done, absolutely. But the research points to the fact that a lot of the work is acceptable if it's volunteering.
And it's interesting actually as well what comes out of you telling us a little bit more about the book and the people you've interviewed and yourself is there's really that you're at the crossroads of different elements that may or may not work with each other. One, which is the work environment and the personal life, being a woman versus being a man, being from a culture or from a different culture and so on. And it's interesting because suddenly you can hear that how all these things kind of intertwined might make it sometimes even more challenges. And I think there is an element there where being resilient is even more needed, because you have to juggle and balance all these plates and all these demands, as you said,
and I can tell you this
could be very different.
I'm sorry. I can tell you the story that inspired me to work on this. So when I had the idea to work on this book, I was already teaching, and I have a busy brain. And so I was out for summer and I started thinking about past experiences. And I remembered a story that happened earlier in my career. I was at the same level in a professional position as this peer that I had, who was a man, about 13 to 15 years older than I was, Caucasian. And a new position came up that was a supervisory position, and they were trying to do an internal promotion first before they went out to try to recruit from the outside. And so I applied for the promotion, he applied for the promotion, but I had more education than he had, so I ended up getting the job. And so the next day you get to work and you go from being peers to now me being his supervisor, right? Which is a hard situation to be in for both sides. And there are other people in the office and all that in this whole dynamic, but they hadn't applied for the job or anything. So that next day I get to work and I have an email from him that said, if you think I'm going to report to a woman, and a much younger woman than me, you're very wrong. And in that moment, I had to make a decision of how I was going to reply to that, and how we were going to handle that relationship from that point on. So it took me a little bit to think. And then I ended up responding with, thank you for sharing your thoughts, and we're going to have to learn to work together.
Mm-hmm.
And so thinking about this, and I was like, years later thinking, I cannot believe that this guy sent me this email. And I was thinking about like how culturally we were so different, right? That he was a man, I was a woman, he was Caucasian. Well, my ethnicity is, like my race is Caucasian, but like ethnicity wise, I'm Latina, and I was much younger than him, right?
Mm-hmm.
So all of those elements coming together, I'm like, this is an interesting thing to explore, and I'm sure that other people have their stories to share. So,
and I'm very glad you did that, because I think there are some amazing stories out there, and as you said, you have 8 of these stories, but there's probably hundreds more out
absolutely
there, and yeah, it's important, I think, not to forget
absolutely
that this probably still happens today, even though maybe not as much or as often or differently, but it probably still happens. And there are many people in that situation. So how do we support that as well? And how do we support them? So thank you so much for sharing this. Thank you actually for sharing all these things, your story and all the things you've been through, and a little bit more about the work you've been doing and you're still doing as well with these young people. And I'm glad it was lovely to hear that it still perdures as well with these young people who've traveled and still talk about it today. So it's definitely a very positive thing to see. Before we close on today's episode, I want to ask you, what's one thing you would want to leave our listeners with when it comes to culture or anything else actually that is important in that space of diversity and inclusion?
I would go back to us going through the exercise of putting ourselves in other people's shoes and trying to see the world from different perspectives, and accepting that maybe our perspective is right, maybe our perspective could be wrong, or maybe there is no right or wrong, right? There's a lot of gray. I think that as we do that, we learn to share our spaces, and instead of just like trying to force ourselves on other people. And I think that by doing this, we can help our little circles where we live be stronger, for sure.
Thank you so much for sharing these. And my last question then would be, if any of our listeners wants to reach out to you, what's the best way to do so?
So on Instagram, I have an Instagram account for the book, which is silencing _biases_in_leadership. I know it's a big name.
We'll share it in the notes anyway.
Yes,
so
please.
Not a
Or
problem.
you can also email me at montoya.csa@gmail.com.
Brilliant. Camilla, thank you so much for being part of this episode. I really, really enjoyed our conversation. Loved your story and loved everything you've done, and looking forward to seeing more of it. So thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. I love talking about this stuff.
Well, I'm sure we'll have the chance to connect again and then maybe go even deeper on some of these topics. So
I would love to.
Looking forward to it.
Thank you so much.
Thanks again. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave a rating and review. We'd love to hear from you. To catch all the latest from us, You can follow us on Instagram, Facebook, or YouTube at As Diverse as Two Peas in a Pod. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.